the Middle East. الشرق الأوسط. המזרח התיכון. خاور میانه. Orta The 20th century has brought extraordinary changes to almost every corner of the Middle East. But the way Middle Easterners have responded to change has varied enormously. At one end of the spectrum, there is Turkey, which has gone furthest toward a Western way of life. And at the other end, there is Saudi Arabia, which, while undergoing great changes, has perhaps done the most to retain its ancient tradition and culture. In this program, we're going to take a closer look at these two countries, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, as examples of two quite different ways of adapting to the modern age. And we'll see some of the effects that these adaptations have had on the lives of the Turks and the Saudis over the last 40 years or so. Let's start with Turkey. Turkey's neighbors to the west are Greece and Bulgaria. To the north, the Soviet Union. To the east, Iran, and to the south, Syria and Iraq. The population of Turkey is now about 48 million people, 85% of whom are Turks. The principal minority group is that of the Kurds, who make up about 12% of the population. But 98% of the inhabitants of Turkey, whether Turks or Kurds, are Muslims, the great majority of whom are Sunnis. Now we'll hear the expert opinion of someone from Turkey concerning the major changes that have taken place in that country since 1945. Dr. Ülkü Bates.
1945 was the end of the Second World War. Although Turkey had not participated in the war, I think it came out quite poor and rather at the brink, at the very edge of change. And the major change that was introduced together with the end of the war was the multi-party system. Until then, from 1923 to 45, it was single party, first Atatürk and after his death, İnönü. But 45 meant that many segments of Turkey, of the population, could participate in the government, which they did. I think many alliances were formed along ethnic and perhaps religious and regional lines. Parties came into being after 45, various parties, which worked itself up to 1950. 1950, the majority of the people voted for the Democratic Party, the Menderes regime. And there is a curious change then from the urban elite to the, if I can say, to the masses, or to an enormous participation in the running of Turkey. But that also brought, I think it was felt very strongly in the 50s, the segmentation of the country, diversification of the society. In 58, Menderes government didn't seem to be prepared for this diversification in the society. Yeah. They were not prepared for, perhaps for the social and economic changes that were taking place. They tried to ignore and later tried to oppress the opposition from wherever it came, from the ultra-right or from ultra-left. They tried to suppress this. In 1958-59, 147 professors were forced to retire, whatever their age or rank were. I had two of my professors just suddenly not attending to classes. Also, the university was not a very comfortable place to be present at that time. The police did not enter the university compound in Istanbul, but they were always present at the door, and it was very uneasy feeling, as if everybody informed on each other, or everybody was looking at waiting for something to happen. I must say, in those years, from 59 to 61, I did not attend very many classes, whether they were being held or not, and I don't think my friends came to classes, or my classmates came to classes. That led to the military takeover, the very first military takeover in Turkey in 1961, 27th of May 1961. Then, when we came back to the university, I think that happened on a Friday. So on Monday, everybody was hugging each other as if everybody had accomplished something, whether we came to classes or not, or whether we took part in the protest or not. And then the students were unified. They were all the opponents of the Menderes regime, whatever their backgrounds were, whether they came from Eastern Turkey or from Istanbul, they were all unified. From 61 to 63, the military remained ruling in Turkey. They formed the government, and the transition occurred after the elections of 63. That it was not a single party, but it was a coalition, which failed many times. Between, if I'm not wrong, I might be between 61 and 1980. There were about 19 governments in Turkey. The changes were very fast and almost continuous. People became extremely distressed about that lack of centralized government. But that lack of centralization in Turkey, I think, began in 1945 with the multi-party system and suddenly erupted in the 60s and 70s. We saw the terrorism that occurred is, I think, the continuation, or perhaps coming to peak, of that diversification in society, that rapid change that was taking place in Turkey. Turkey is caught in between. It is European in one sense. In its political system, I see Turkey being very different from other countries in the Middle East, in that it is a republic. It is a democratic country. It is in its own terms. I'm not comparing to a country in Europe, but in terms of government, I think it is still a democratic country. It is also a secular country because the laws are stressed at that point. It is also, the constitution stresses that the nation is Turkish, but it does not say that it is an Islamic country. So it's not anywhere in the constitution or in any other constitutions that were written since 1923. Therefore, I regard Turkey as a secular country in the Middle East. But culturally speaking, Turkey is a Middle Eastern country. If you ask me why, I would say the attitude towards the modesty of women, I think, is very Middle Eastern. It's an Islamic country. Or attitude towards family, marriage, divorce, kinship. I have been married now to an American for 20 years. First 10 years were quite difficult. It was a period perhaps when I myself was not very sure whether I had any right to bring a non-Muslim American, North American husband to my family. They did not raise too many objections, I must say. I must give credit to my family. They accepted him. I think they like him now more than they like me. But I was, for the first 10 years, very much at ease with myself. In Turkey, being a Muslim country, objects to the marriage of a woman outside of religion, outside of the approved circle of people that she can marry. Turkey is a Muslim country, and it's deeply religious country. I think in all segments of Turkey, it might be secular on one hand, but it would never deny the people. 99% of the population would not deny its religion. May not attend a mosque on Fridays, but I think they would, whenever possible, they would at least profess that they are Muslims. And Islam is the way of life, I think, on the cultural level. But I must say, Turkey did go through a period of ignoring the past or taking progress in a wrong sense, in that the past was seen as hampering the present and the future, and they tried to almost put it aside and try to bring a new face to Turkey. That could be the conflict between trying to be a Western country and at the same time a Muslim country. On one hand, they try to keep their heritage, the Muslim heritage. Of course, it's part of everybody's past into 99% the background. But they try to be a European city in building these skyscrapers, or trying to build roads around what they called almost belt line, I think, if I'm not mistaken, destroying walls from Byzantine period, from the 5th, 6th century. So this conflict, whether Turkey is a Western country or a Muslim country, whether it is a country that is part of European Council or is still a country that has its roots in the Ottoman past, Ottoman Muslim Islamic past, is always present, and perhaps it will be never resolved. It is, again, a country, a secular country, on the other hand, a religious country. On one hand, it tries to be a part of Europe. On the other hand, everything else ties it culturally to the Middle East, to the Arab countries, to Iran. So it's caught in between, caught in conflict.
Rapid as the changes are that have taken place in Turkey in recent times, they are far outpaced by what has been happening to Saudi Arabia, which has been forced to telescope hundreds of years of human progress into the span of a single generation. And yet, in spite of everything, the Saudis have somehow managed to remain more faithful to their traditional way of life than perhaps any other Middle Eastern country. Saudi Arabia has many neighbors. To the west are Egypt, the Sudan, and Ethiopia. To the south, the two Yemens and Oman. To the east, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, and Iran. And to the north, Kuwait, Iraq, and Jordan. The population of Saudi Arabia is about 8 million people, 99% of whom are Sunni Muslims. Now we'll hear from someone from Saudi Arabia who grew up in that country during the period when it was being transformed from a simple desert kingdom into one of the richest countries on earth, Ahmed Ashembri.
The unification of Saudi Arabia is probably one of the most important events in the 20th century, probably in the world history, not just to the Saudis themselves. It's the peninsula, which has been stagnant and fragmented for more than 1,000 years, now comes back to life in one unit. The most important steps, in my opinion, was at education, which started just after the establishment of the kingdom, was, in my opinion, more important on the long run than what many people in the rest of the world think as oil more important. And the concentration of the government on or the stress of the government on to take care of the human resources, to me, was the most important step, regardless of any other considerations. And besides, the government or the country itself has passed through many stages. The early stage of the unification and the establishment of law and order is, I think, the most important step for development of a society. As we hear from our grandparents, that we should be grateful for such a step of unification, because before, law and order was absent and nobody was safe. And virtually everybody you talk to these days, regardless of whatever his ambition or his thoughts, he considers public safety as the most important thing. And besides, the coming of Saudi Arabia to the international stage, especially in the 70s, was another step that made people think of Saudis in terms of oil, not in terms of existing human society in there. But now we are in a stage of maturing society, which will carry us for the next generation, which we hope will be a fruitful one. And still, the stress on education, for example, on the 15,000 students who are studying abroad, especially in the United States, sooner or later, all of them will return, and that itself is a gigantic step in the transformation of the country. One of these ills that comes with transforming a different culture to another one is that it might pick with it the ills such as, if one compares, for example, crime rate in the West. I grew up in the East Coast in the United States, and I've seen vivid example of crime that are sometimes beyond explanation. I think that's not at all common in Saudi Arabia. And my interpretation of that is that the society itself has its own formula that one cannot see, but it exists, of moral ethos, of religious values, of social appreciation of the community itself, one's own community. For here, the Western culture emphasizes more the individualistic side of a person, not his communal side, which is not the case in Saudi Arabia, which is everybody is supposed to be raised and culturally oriented. The community comes first. When one talks about the religious character of the country, and you hear often about whether there is a religious fervor in Saudi Arabia, like some other parts of the Islamic or Arabic world. It's, if I may say, it's like talking about how to make the Pope more Catholic, which is, the point is that Saudi Arabia itself was established as a country or as a nation through the means of preserving the religion or serving to preserve the culture and heritage of Islam. And to talk about a fanatic movement of any sort is very redundant, because it's trying to be repeating what's already been said with no reason, because the revival of the Islamic ethos, one of its main goals is an orderly society that's tempered with religious feelings that have been, prior to the establishment of the kingdom, was almost lost. And the raison d'etre of the survival of the Saudi government or the Saudi society in general is based on how to preserve their own cultural background without necessarily rejecting any modern technological achievements in the West or the East. Everybody in the society, in the Saudi society, feels he is protected and he should be protector of his own culture. And the feeling that through Islamic background, we do feel at home with our own culture. We do not feel alienated. We do not feel just we are talking about an epoch that lies in antiquity. The days of Muhammad, the days of the conquests, the days of the Islamic Empire, the days of when huge libraries in Spain, in Baghdad, and Central Asia, they still live with us. The memory is not just a fantasy or just to remember for the sake of remembrance. It's part of our daily thinking about our own lives, of how to improve it, of how to revive or make a rebirth of our own past. A past that's not just lies in books, but in our own daily living. We still refer in our daily life to the days of Omar when he says, if poverty was a creature, I would have destroyed it. And it's like an emphasis in the essence of poverty, which sometimes could affect human dignity. On this basis, the government, either on taking care of social security or channeling the income of the country in ways that would eliminate the need for people to suffer, at least for the basic livings. I wouldn't say that everybody is living in a utopia, but that was the aim, the dream of everybody in the country. And I think the country is heading in the right direction. And I wouldn't think of my children one day would starve, which is a great step. They will have the ultimate in education. They will never fall sick and don't find anybody to take care of them. It's a sense of duty. It's a duty of the feeling of the government, a duty to take care of its people, with a sense that it's responsible for it. And that would create, in my opinion, a psychological, healthy attitude toward life. If you talk to a Saudi about his future, he wouldn't have any hesitations of thoughts. He would just be bright and open, because he doesn't see any limitations to it. I think that many people maybe envy it, maybe sometimes try to tell you how to do it, but I think people are comfortable with themselves and they can do it. I think they know how to run their own lives, and I think they are doing great now.
In the West, we often complain about the traumatic effect of the rapid changes that have taken place over the last couple of generations. But at least for us, the cultural groundwork for these changes was laid down over several centuries. In the Middle East, there was no such groundwork. The whole superstructure of the modern world was just plopped down on top of a very different cultural foundation. Under the circumstances, the Middle Easterners are coping really quite well with having their whole world turned upside down and inside out. Of different religious, ethnic, and tribal groups. Lebanon is bounded on the south by Israel and on the north and east by Syria. The total population of Lebanon is about 3.5 million people. Of these, roughly 2 million are Muslims and 1.5 million are Christians. The Muslims consist of 1 million Shias, 600,000 Sunnis, and 350,000 Druze. The main Christian groups are made up of about 600,000 Maronites, 300,000 Greek Orthodox, and 250,000 Armenians. Now we'll hear from an expert from Lebanon, what he feels are the main events that have shaped that country over the last 40-odd years. Dr. Abdul Latif Harris.
The National Pact of 1943 was very important because it was the first document on which the Lebanese agreed actually to share a country together. Before 1943, the Christians and the Muslims, the Muslims did not want to be a part of Lebanon. They actually felt that they were part of the Arab world and mostly of Syria. And what they wanted to be is just part of Syria. And the Christians at the same time, they wanted a homeland, a Christian's homeland of their own, but feeling that their country in their own land, especially in the mountain, is not economically viable without the coastal cities of Beirut, Tripoli, Sidon, and the fertile lands of the Bekaa Valley. And that's why there was necessary for these two major religious groups to come together to reach an agreement. And that agreement have actually reflected the pluralistic nature of the Lebanese society. In general, this agreement have just, on one hand, satisfied the Muslim by claiming the Arab character of Lebanon on one side, and on the other side, it satisfied also the Christians by also recognizing the Western side of the Lebanese culture. The next important event was the revolution of this war, the Civil War of 1958. During this period, even though Lebanon was economically a prosperous country, it seems that the Lebanese president have just neglected some aspects of the national pact and have agreed on some foreign policy in which the Muslims of the country have just disagreed. And among this policy, it was the fact that Lebanon did not break diplomatic relationship with England and France in 1956 after Israel, England, and France attacked Egypt. And at that time, most Arab countries did break diplomatic relation with France and England, and Lebanon refused to do so. And also the president of Lebanon at that time, Kamel Shamoun, from 1952 to 1958, accepted the Eisenhower Doctrine, which most Arab countries rejected at that time. And this angered the Muslim of the country, and they felt that the country was more and more neglecting one of the most important aspects of the political nature of the Lebanese state. And then after 1958, I think from 1958 to 1964, Lebanon witnessed one of its most important periods. Fuad Shihab, the Lebanese president at that period, from 1958 to 1964, was one of the most important figures in Lebanon's political life. He was able for the first time to introduce some sort of political and social reform. And this reform, which is called the Shihab's reform, have for the first time united the Lebanese together. And loyalty of the Lebanese at that period has shifted from loyalty to their own sect to loyalty to the Lebanese state. And he was able to do this by introducing some kind of administrative reform and by considering qualification as the basis of employment. And this was not the case before Fuad Shihab or before this period, and even not after this period. And also Shihab was able to introduce some kind of agricultural reform, and he created the Green Project in which millions of Lebanese pounds were spent on land reclamation and cultivations, and many projects for irrigations were established at that period. However, this period, despite the fact that Lebanon have enjoyed some kind of stability and national unity, there was some controversy about his presidency. The Christians felt that it's too much concession which were given to the Muslims at the expense of the Christian prerogatives. They felt that because most of the areas which benefited from this reform were mostly Muslim areas. So they felt that for a long time that most of the taxes, like 80% of the taxes in the country are paid by the Christians, and therefore they should get most of the government spending. So they believe that people who pay more should get more. And after this, actually, I would say that by the end of 1964, Shihab himself have felt that his reform is not going to last. And he actually, in 1970, he refused to be elected again as president of Lebanon. And he said he doesn't believe that there is a way of reforming the political system in Lebanon, or he felt actually that the Lebanese politicians are not ready to accept a reform which will put Lebanon on the road toward modernization and social justice. So the civil war of 1974-75 has been predicted since then. Many people felt that Lebanon's political and social system is declining, and they were waiting for the moment when everything was going to explode. And because of the endless war which has started in 1975, many aspects of the Lebanese society is being transferred and changed. In today's Lebanon, while the Sunnis of Lebanon still identify themselves with the Arabs, the Shiites have more and more identified themselves now with the Iranians. And actually most of the Shiites of the south have some Persian roots. So they are reviving their roots in that period. And that's how even the differences between Sunnis and Shiites has some kind of ethnic background. And the conflict between Iran and Iraq and the Arab world has also affected the politics of Lebanon, while the Sunnis of Lebanon are sympathetic with the Sunnis, with the Sunni of Iraq. We see that the Shiites are sympathetic with Iran, and that's how their attitude toward the Arabs has been changed since the Iran-Iraq war. And feeling that they are more powerful now, they were able to dissociate themselves from the Arabs and to establish their own identity as Shiites on one hand and also as some ethnic group which is different from the Arabs. And that's what actually also the Maronites have been trying to do since a long time ago. And it's one of the important issues in Lebanon's politics, because the Maronites claim that they are not Arabs and they are Phoenicians, or some of them believe they have some French roots, and some others believe maybe they are Mediterraneans. But they all agree on one fact, that they are not Arabs, and they identify themselves with the Phoenicians, despite the fact that the Maronites moved to Lebanon in the 7th century from Syria. And they were always mountain dwellers, where the Phoenicians were city dwellers. The Phoenicians used to live in Beirut, Tripoli, Sidon. They have never lived in the mountains. And if this was one of the controversial points among the Muslims and the Christians, now it's one of the controversial points also among the Sunnis and the Shiites. So the identity of Lebanon as being perceived by the Lebanese, it has created some problems before, but these problems are getting more and more complex, which make everything actually clear at the same time, because Lebanon is a pluralistic society, and the Lebanese have to realize that without freedom and without realization or recognition of this pluralistic aspect of the society, Lebanon cannot survive.
Lebanon presents probably the most complex of all Middle Eastern problems. But there's no denying that the whole region is very complicated. Not only that, but as we've tried to show in this series, many aspects of the Middle Eastern way of life are very different from what we're used to in the West. In North America in particular, we have to make a huge effort to wrench ourselves away from our normal way of thinking in order to understand the Middle Easterners, because they have been molded by a history that is very different from ours. To start with, it's a very much longer history. Our North American society has only been in existence for about 300 years. And even European civilization has only been around for about 2,000 years or so. Whereas Middle Eastern civilization dates back well over 7,000 years. In all this time, It's hardly surprising that Middle Eastern society has grown intricate and convoluted, symbolized so graphically by that most ubiquitous of all Middle Eastern images, the arabesque, which weaves itself into 1,001 different forms almost everywhere you look. We've only been able to highlight some of the major patterns in this intricate design, the all-pervasive nature of religion in the Middle East, the importance of the family and its effect on women in particular, authoritarian traditions of government, sectarian differences within the major religions, and so on. Where do we go from here? A Western diplomat who specialized in the Middle East once said if he'd predicted in 1970 that by 1980 oil prices would multiply 11 times, a religious revolution would topple the Shah, and Egypt would sign a peace treaty with Israel, his government would have fired him as a lunatic. So we won't make any predictions. But we can point to some interesting trends. First of all, as in most of the Third World, there is a population explosion in the Middle East. In 1930, there were about 80 million people in the Middle East. Today, there are over 230 million, and most of these people are ending up in the cities. The most distressing example of this is Cairo, whose population increases by 250,000 people every year. Because of the rapid population growth, most Middle Easterners are very young. Over 1/2 of them are under 18 years old. These young people are the future of the Middle East. In what direction will they go? What sort of identity will they have? Well, if we look again at the 4 major peoples of the Middle East, we see that 3 of these peoples do now at least have a single territorial identity. Most Turks live in one country, Turkey. The Iranians live in Iran. And the overwhelming majority of Jews in the Middle East live in Israel. But the Arabs are split up among a score of different countries. Why don't the Arabs just form themselves into one large Arab state? Well, they've tried to on numerous occasions. The Ba'ath Party in Syria and Iraq was founded for that very purpose over 40 years ago. But the Ba'athist attempts at Arab unity have never met with much success. Gamal Abdel Nasser also championed Pan-Arabism when he established the United Arab Republic in 1958. But that arrangement fell apart a few years later, as has every other attempt at the unification of the Arab world. This accounts for one of the strangest aspects of the Arab-Israeli conflict. There is tiny Israel, surrounded by a score of Arab countries, and outnumbered nearly 50-1 by the Arabs. And yet most of the battles fought between Israel and the Arab states have been won by Israel, mainly because the Arabs have not been united. Why is it so difficult for the Arabs to get together? One reason is because the populations of various Arab states are strung out over such a vast area. They're like an archipelago of little islands in a huge desert sea. And there are large economic discrepancies between the way people live in these islands. Some have become very rich from oil, others are still very poor. Some are very modern, others are very traditional. And most of the Arab countries are fragmented into religious and ethnic divisions. not only Sunnis and Shias and Maronites and Copts, but also large groups of non-Arabs as well, such as the Berbers in North Africa or the Kurds in Iraq. So any attempt at a nice, clear-cut Arab identity is muddied by dozens of other sub-identities. Whether the Arabs will ever succeed in uniting into one country is an open question. But one thing is certain. In general, all across the Middle East, religious identities are becoming stronger and stronger. This is most noticeable in the case of Islam. But it also applies to Christianity and Judaism. But since 95% of the Middle Easterners are Muslims, it is Islam that has the greatest impact. And it is the young Muslims, not the old, who are returning to the fundamentals of their religion and taking all the injunctions in the Quran literally, whether they refer to very personal things, such as the need for a man to grow a beard, or for a woman to cover up every part of her body except her hands and face, or to more general matters, such as the Islamic banking system, which precludes the lending of money at interest, or to Islamic law, which prohibits alcohol and gambling. Why this religious revival? It's part of a general reaction against the West. Politically, all the Middle Eastern countries are now independent of the Western world, and yet they are still culturally dependent. They're still being swamped by Western products and values and lifestyles. Of course, this is part of a global trend toward a common material culture. People on a beach in Israel look very much like beachgoers in Florida. A discotheque in Istanbul might just as well be in Manhattan. But many young Middle Easterners are now rebelling against all this. They're trying to buck this trend toward global uniformity by demanding cultural independence. And the most powerful alternative to Western culture that they can find is Islamic culture. How far will this swing back to fundamental Islam go? Again, it's difficult to say, because there are such powerful forces pulling in the opposite direction. Apart from anything else, the economies of most Middle Eastern countries are inextricably tied to the economies of Europe, Japan, and the United States. Even though Iranian mobs may chant, "Na Sharqi, na Gharbi," no East, no West, Iranian oil and gas are still sold to the highest bidder, wherever he comes from. And finally, of course, simply to survive in today's world, the Middle East must continue to modernize and to invest in the latest technology. But is it possible to modernize without Westernizing? Can you take the machines and the techniques of the West and leave the ideas and values behind? Can you combine a modern identity with an Islamic identity? For many Middle Easterners, the answer is yes. Whether they're right or not remains to be seen. But how will all these things affect what is going on in the major Middle East trouble spots? The borders of Israel, Lebanon, Iran and Iraq, the Gulf. When a medieval Muslim writer came to the end of a series of speculations about the world, he would often write, "And God knows better." Since events in the Middle East have such a disturbing tendency to overturn all predictions, perhaps we too should end on that humble note. Allahu A'lam. self-determination. One by one, each of the countries in the region has become politically independent. In this program,